America's hot topic, like non-citizens and voting rights. Who needs boring, straightforward elections when you can have a partisan showdown over local voting rights? Welcome back to Beyond the Build Number, where we break down interesting legislation with a dash of wit and a splash of sass. I'm Sarah, your host, and with me as always is my legislative partner in crime, Stephen. Today, we have our first double header looking at non-citizen voting in the U.S. First, we're diving into H.R. 192, a bill aiming to prohibit non-U.S. citizens from voting in D.C. elections. Next week, we'll look at the SAVE Act, which wants to make sure only citizens vote in federal elections. Ready to get into it, Stephen?
Absolutely, Sarah.
So it seems like there is a huge focus on prohibiting non-citizens from voting here in the States lately. This makes me wonder, do you guys have similar concern in the UK?
Well, yeah, it used to be a big deal, but then, of course, we made the wonderful decision to leave the EU, and so it's less of an issue now. But when we were in the EU, we were part of this huge bloc of 28 different countries, and one of the pillars of the EU is freedom of movement. So free movement of people and goods. So in particular with people, anybody who lives in one of the EU member states has the right to live and work in any other member state. And you don't really need sort of documents to travel. You're allowed to go there. You're protected by law, so you have to be treated exactly the same as a citizen of that country that you're living in. Apart from when it comes to elections. So with elections, as an EU citizen, you're allowed to vote in local elections in the country you're living in, but you're not allowed to vote in national elections, which is sort of quite an interesting distinction. So it meant that it was quite a complicated setup where certain people could vote in certain types of elections. No one was quite sure when they're allowed to vote, which is so very similar to the issues that are raised with this DC bill. But it did lead to some quite interesting little problems. So a lot of British people retire to the south coast of Spain because the weather's really nice. It's cheaper than the UK.
Love it there.
And when we were in the EU, it's great. So when we were in the EU, that was very, very simple. You could just go and live there. You could get your pension and all your various sort of payments and things paid to there, and that was fine. So these big communities built up in the south coast of Spain, which were almost all just British people, British retired people living there. Now, these people had the right to vote in local elections. And so there are certain sort of municipalities in Spain where the British people were like the majority. So they were voting in their own people. So you actually had British expats who were getting positions on local councils and things. Now, obviously, the Spanish were a little bit concerned about this. They didn't like it very much, about the fact that you had British people basically making these local laws in Spain. So it became a bit of an issue. Obviously, since we've left the EU, the expats have a slightly tougher time of it, and they're not allowed to vote now, and they're not allowed to be citizens unless they actually became Spanish citizens, which I think was sort of one of the options that they had. So it was sort of very interesting, really. We obviously had sort of laws that have come in recent year about voter ID as well, which sort of say that you have to be able to prove your identity to actually vote, which we haven't had until quite recently, and they've caused quite a lot of problems as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting because on the one hand, I really understand the approach there and how it was supposed to be, but it's so funny how exactly the thing that could happen happened. And what's concerning because, everybody who lives in a community should probably have a say in what the community is doing, if they're paying taxes to that community and all of those kinds of things. And, I think that's something that here in the States is very overlooked a lot, is a lot of the people who have immigrated here, pay sales tax every time they buy something in the country, so they're at least paying that tax. They're still investing in their local communities as well where they live.
The distinction in the US, and we can get into this later talking about documented versus undocumented, obviously the majority of non-citizens are documented. There's a small minority that are undocumented, and there's a big question mark about whether they would want to vote, because surely if you're undocumented you tend to keep your head down, right? The last thing you do is register to vote. Why would you do that? And certainly in this country, obviously we also have illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants and so on, and there's never any question of them voting. It's just not something that anyone ever raises here when we're talking about election integrity and so on, because it's quite a strange concept to think they would, and because they're a relatively small number as well, are they genuinely going to be able to, are enough of them going to do that to actually influence an election? I think that's sort of a big question.
Yeah, it's one of my really good friends, she's lived in the States since her first year of high school. and she's from Toronto. And so she's been here, I think, she's probably 32 or something like that. So she's been here almost 20 years, and she's just now becoming a citizen. And she's like about to take her test, I think maybe next week. But she's been here forever. Like, she went to high school here, she went to college here, she's worked here for over 10 years. She's married to a guy from New Jersey. And it is so funny because I feel like whenever anybody reads things like this about non-citizens, especially when we're talking about DC, which is a very international place where it has a lot of people there, people are like, oh, it's the undocumented immigrants. But it's like, no, it actually can be literally anyone that's living here legally. I have a lot of friends from Canada that live here, and they're always like, yeah, no, we don't vote. And I was like, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Joe's kind of don't think of that with the US.
Maybe they should.
Yes.
Maybe they should be elected.
Right.
Just to finish on this, I would say that while people in America tend not to know very much about politics in other countries, here in the UK, we know a lot about American politics, so we follow it very closely. And people often say that we should have the right to vote in US elections because whatever happens in the US affects us so profoundly in terms of our own economy, our own defense, and all these other things that maybe we should have a say. So maybe everybody should get to vote in the US elections.
I think we might be a little bit more balanced if we had somebody helping us move forward. Okay. Let's unravel this bill and see what's really going on. So HR 192 is designed to stop non-citizens from voting in local elections in DC. We're talking about everything from the mayor to school boards, but non-citizens already can't vote in federal elections. Why this extra step?
Well, Sarah, the bill's proponents, like Congressman August Pfluger, argue that even non-citizen participation in local elections can undermine election integrity. They're worried about the potential influence on decisions affecting residents' everyday lives, especially given DC's unique position under federal oversight.
And speaking of Congressman Pfluger? Fluger.
I looked it up. Pfluger.
Not a word I am used to pronouncing. He's been quite persistent with this bill, right? Like, it was first introduced in 2022, and he keeps reintroducing it. What is his kind of motive behind it?
Well, he claims that the bill was a reaction to the DC's City Council move to let non-citizens vote in local elections after just 30 days of residency. Pfluger and his supporters see this as a threat to election integrity, especially given their concerns over undocumented immigrants potentially voting.
Interesting. But didn't the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act already pass after facing some heavy opposition?
Yes, it did. It was quite a controversial bit of legislation in the end, and it faced a lot of bipartisan pushback, but it still managed to pass in the end. So people may be aware of this, that DC Council gets to set its own laws. So in a certain way, it's sort of independent, more so certainly than other districts. But importantly, Congress has a veto power. So if Congress don't like anything that the DC Council does, they can introduce a bill, pass the bill through both houses, and then the president has to sign it. But they can then say, no, we're vetoing this. And it has happened in the past. We saw some obviously quite big issues. But this one, even though there was quite a lot of pushback, and they didn't quite manage to get to the point where they're actually vetoing it, even though they tried very hard. So it did actually pass. As soon as the bill passed, it was immediately challenged in court by 7 DC voters. Their assertion was that their votes would be diluted in some way if you allowed all of these non-citizens to vote as well. There's obviously be more people voting, their votes would count for less. Okay, it's a bit of an odd argument, really. And the challenge was eventually dismissed by the district court, and the court stated that citizens' vote wouldn't be devalued by non-citizen participation, and said that their challenge eventually wasn't valid.
There's 2 really interesting pieces there that, one, I want to highlight to anybody listening today. If you do not know how the DC Council passes legislation, it is so fascinating. And I think I wrote a blog about it. Somebody else may have, but it's on Bill Track 50. Look it up. It is perplexing and interesting and such a convoluted way of passing stuff. Go look at that. But also, I find that argument so intriguing because I hear that a lot from people when we're talking about the Senate and how a person in Wyoming is worth, I can't remember what it is, but it's like 10,000 Californians or something like that. And this voting delusion.
Wyoming would probably agree with that.
Yes. And, you know, it is such an interesting kind of perplexing issue where, you know, how do we ensure that everybody is accurately represented and, you know, as our world keeps changing and, you know, even the weird way that we do even our votes and our presidential election and it's, you know, not by popular majority, but it's just so interesting. And I think that there's a lot of different conversations happening about what is equitable, what is right, and then it's weird when we start talking about it with things like this because then there's always kind of an undertone of you don't belong here, you don't get to participate here. But, you know, if you belong to a community, it is nice to be able to participate in that community. And not everybody in communities is illegal or anything like that. Many people who are non-citizens are legally here. So
it does sort of lead you on naturally to the arguments as well. Well, should DC actually be a state in that case? Or should it just be part of another state? Why on earth does it have this strange status? And then, of course, you've got all the other territories as well. What about Puerto Rico? What about Guam? You know, there are sort of other states out there that aren't fully represented either, and perhaps they should be states too.
Yes, no, I'm with you. But back to the bill at hand. So, HR 192 is essentially a reaction to that district court ruling. How has the bill fared so far in Congress?
Well, it had a new burst of life following the dismissal of the court case in DC, and it passed the House with a significant majority. Actually, it was 262 votes to 143. So it had quite some considerable bipartisan support here. So it's not a purely partisan issue. There's a lot of people who feel that the sort of fundamental principle that you have to be a citizen to vote should be protected under all circumstances, really. But of course, now it's crossed over and it's in the Senate, and its fate there is far less certain, really. You obviously have the Democratic majority there, and then the president would be likely to veto it if it ever went through anyway as well.
This bill seems to have really reignited a debate over non-citizen voting rights. Can you give us a bit of background on the current state of non-citizen voting?
Yes, so the really important thing to state up front is that currently federal law strictly prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. So we're talking about Congress, president, and so on. And there are severe penalties for violations. And we'll discuss this in more detail next week, but it's basically hefty fines, big prison sentences, and obviously if you're an immigrant and you're voting, then you'll be deported. Right? So they'll sort of kick you out of the country as well. So it is strictly prohibited. However, when we come down to local elections, it's a little bit more mixed. Now, historically, of course, non-citizens could vote. Many states between 1776 and 1924 actually allowed non-citizen voting. And then gradually after that, as sort of concerns about immigration started to increase, as America moved from this country saying, yeah, send us everybody, to maybe we don't want everybody, then states began passing these laws. And so now there's only a few municipalities in California, in Maryland and Vermont, as well as obviously DC, that allow limited voting in local elections only. So again, these local elections, you know, local councils and that kind of thing.
Really interesting. And proponents argue that this type of movement is about protecting our elections from the potential influence of non-citizens, especially in light of all of the immigration concerns we've been hearing about kind of ad nauseum here in the States, especially in the last 6 months. But what are kind of the main points here?
Well, yeah, so the immigration is obviously a key point here, that it's a really, really hot topic at the moment in the US, as everybody's well aware, really. economy. This is really what's behind this bill. They claim that allowing non-citizens to vote, even locally, complicates voter registration and could confuse non-citizens about when they're allowed to vote. And so there is a parallel here with what happened in the EU, what happens in the EU right now, and what happened in the UK when we're part of the EU. But again, you just make sure that election documentation is very, very clear about who can vote and who can't vote, and you double check everything. So, there are certainly ways around that. They also argue it's a matter of national security, and it's about maintaining the integrity of Americans as well. So it's part of this general narrative that American elections are under threat, and that the rules and regulations around them need tightening up to make sure that only the right people are allowed to vote, and that you can be absolutely certain that the person who's voting is the person they claim they are. And of course, they really do talk about these undocumented migrants or illegal immigrants voting is the key factor, really, I think, that's driving this bill forward.
But there's opponents to this that say something completely different. What does the opposition to this say?
Well, the opposition have a very clear, simple argument, really. They say that this bill is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, and that it is merely an attempt to undermine the faith in American elections. Which we've sort of seen a lot of over the past few years. And there are even some people who go as far as comparing it to sort of racist attempts in the past to block certain ethnic groups from voting. So there have been various waves of this throughout American history where as you get a certain wave of immigrants, they say, no, we don't want these people, and we certainly shouldn't allow them to vote. So they think it's an attempt to disenfranchise tax-paying residents who contribute to the community and therefore deserve to have a vote, deserve to have a voice in local governance. After all, didn't someone once say no taxation without representation? I recall a while back there was quite a kerfuffle about it.
Is that still a sore point with the election happening in the UK on July 4th? A really great day in the UK's history. Maybe we should move on. So HR 192 is essentially kind of caught in a tug-of-war, it seems, between election integrity and voting rights. Will it pass the Senate? I don't know about that. But one thing's for sure, this debate is not going anywhere.
Absolutely. With elections obviously in the US just around the corner, I think we'll see this issue come up over and over again.
I agree. All right, well, that is a wrap for today's episode of Beyond the Build Number. Thanks for tuning in, and remember to subscribe. Until next time.